In 1982, a gravedigger walked into a quiet cemetery in rural New Jersey. He wasn't chasing a headline. He wasn't looking for a mystery. He was just doing his job. Another ordinary morning, in a place where the loudest sound is usually wind through the trees. But near the edge of the woods, down by a steep embankment, he saw something that didn't belong. From a distance, it looked like a bundle of discarded clothing, maybe trash that had blown in overnight. Then he got closer, and his stomach dropped. It was a body, a teenage girl, and whoever left her there had done something deliberate, something meant to erase her. Her face had been beaten so badly that even the most basic features were unrecognizable. No ID, no wallet, no name, just a red shirt, a skirt with a peacock print, jewelry still clinging to her, and a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had decided to forget her. For decades, that's what happened. She was buried under a headstone that read, "Princess Doe, missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all." And that line sounds poetic until you realize it was also a confession of failure, because for 40 years, nobody could tell her family where she was. Nobody could tell her who did it. And here's the part that makes this case feel unreal. The man who was allegedly responsible didn't stay hidden forever. He confessed from behind bars. He wrote a letter. He offered to talk. And still, nothing moved the way it should have. This is the story of Princess Dawn, known as Dawn, of a killer who nearly carried a secret to the grave, and of a 40-year hunt that proves one thing: even the dead can speak if someone is willing to listen. If you're into cases that crawl under your skin and refuse to leave, subscribe to Unsolved Crime, because the truth is out there, and sometimes it takes decades to drag it into the light. Let's rewind to the beginning, to the life that existed before the headline. Dawn Rita Olanick was born on August 5, 1964, in Manhattan, New York. And she grew up on Long Island in a modest working-class environment, where people knew their neighbors and teenagers tried to carve out identities in the small spaces life gave them. Her parents divorced when she was young, and after that she lived with her mother and siblings. She had a sister and an older brother named Robert, who would later become one of the most important voices in this story. Not because he had answers, but because he carried the burden of not knowing. People who remembered Dawn described her as bright, spirited, the kind of girl who could walk into a room and change the mood without trying. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy, but she mattered. She was a high school student at Connecticut. High school just finished her junior year, 17 years old. The age where your future still feels infinite, where the worst thing you imagine is a bad breakup or a fight with your parents. Then, in the summer of 1982, Dawn stepped outside the boundaries of her ordinary life and vanished into the gaps where predators wait. On June 24, 1982, Dawn left home. That's the confirmed fact. The details around it are messy, like so many missing teen cases from that era. Some accounts suggest she left on her own. Other versions imply she was told to leave. Sometimes families remember things differently when grief and guilt settle in, and sometimes the record itself gets distorted by time and rumor. But what matters is the outcome. Dawn walked out the door and didn't come back. At first, people may have assumed she'd return after a day or two. Teenagers run off, cool down, show up again. But the days stretched into weeks. Weeks turned into silence. And somewhere in that silence, Dawn went from gone for now to missing. The terrifying part about the missing weeks isn't just that we don't know where she was. That the time between leaving home and being found murdered is the exact space where someone can do anything and leave almost nothing behind. Investigators would eventually focus on a man named Arthur Kinlaw. Kinlaw wasn't a mysterious stranger with no history. He was a convicted criminal, a man tied to violence against women, and according to later testimony, someone who exploited vulnerable girls across multiple Long Island towns. His pattern, as it's been described, was predatory and systematic. He targeted teenagers and runaways, girls who were broke, scared, and disconnected from anyone who could protect them. He didn't need to force a door open. He looked for doors that were already hanging loose. Authorities came to believe that after leaving home, Dawn may have been staying around the West Babylon area, exactly the kind of place where she could slip into anonymity, and exactly the kind of place where someone like Kinlaw could find her. And if you want the simplest explanation for why Dawn became Princess Doe, it's this: once someone is alone, the world gets dangerous fast. A teenage girl without a safety net becomes visible to the wrong people, and invisible to everyone else. What we know next comes largely from statements attributed to Kinlaw's wife, Dawn, accounts that surfaced years later and would become central to investigators. Her description paints a picture of Dawn being brought into Kinlaw's orbit, evaluated, and treated not like a person, but like an object, something to be used or discarded. Donna claimed Kinlaw tried to recruit Dawn into his operation, and when Dawn refused, the situation turned lethal. There's something deeply haunting about that idea. Dawn, 17, alone, facing a grown man with a criminal network, still saying no, still refusing to be turned into a commodity. That refusal, according to the later narrative, is the moment the case crosses from exploitation into murder. Because for certain predators, the worst possible thing you can do is deny them control. Now we arrive at the discovery that started the legend of Princess Doe. Thursday, July 15, 1982. Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. A place that sits quietly off a highway, surrounded by trees and hills. The kind of town where people expect tragedies to happen somewhere else. The gravedigger George Kasim moved toward the rear section near a steep bank that sloped down toward a creek. At first, he saw feet. Just feet, partly obscured, as if someone had tossed a mannequin down the embankment. Then he saw it was human. A young girl lying on her back, partially clothed. Her face was destroyed by blunt force. Trauma so severe that identification by recognition wasn't just hard, it was impossible. The scene wasn't just a murder. It looked like an attempt to erase the victim as a person. She wore a red top, and nearby or on her legs was a skirt with a peacock pattern. She had no shoes, no socks, no undergarments. A small cross necklace was tangled in her hair. Earrings still hung from one ear. Red nail polish was visible but only on one hand, like someone had started painting and never finished. And the detail that refuses to leave your mind. There were injuries on her hands and arms, consistent with defensive wounds. She fought back. She tried to protect herself. Whatever happened there, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. Police arrived to a scene that offered almost nothing useful in the way law enforcement usually needs it. No ID, no fingerprints that could be matched. Decomposition had begun, accelerated by summer heat. The medical examiner concluded the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and skull, with multiple fractures. Over time, investigators would suspect a weapon like a baseball bat. But early on, even that kind of conclusion is hard when you're reworking with limited physical evidence and no confirmed identity. Toxicology didn't give clean answers because of the condition of the body, and the basic profile was heartbreakingly simple. A teenage girl, estimated between 14 and 18, about 5 feet 2, around 110 pounds, never pregnant, appendix and tonsils intact, teeth with small distinguishing characteristics. That was it. A forensic outline of a life that should have had a name attached to it and didn't. Then something happened that almost never happens in cases like this. Someone decided she would not vanish into paperwork. Lieutenant Eric Kannenoffen, credited in retellings as one of the first responders, who pushed for visibility, made an emotional decision with practical consequences. He gave her a name, Princess Doe, not to romanticize her death, but to give her a human presence in a system that can reduce victims to evidence tags. The department pushed the case into the media. Composite sketches were created of what she may have looked like. Photos of her clothes were circulated. And Princess Doe became the first unidentified person entered into the NCIC database. A landmark moment that changed how unidentified victims could be tracked nationally. That decision mattered. Because once a victim becomes known to the system without a real name, the possibility of connection grows. But for years, even with publicity, no one came forward to claim her. No mother calling in panic. No sibling recognizing the skirt. No friend saying, "That's her." The silence lasted so long, it began to feel permanent. Of course, tips came in hundreds. One of the most haunting early leads came from a woman who reported seeing a girl wearing that distinctive outfit just days before the body was found. She said the girl was in a supermarket across from the cemetery, buying cigarettes, hair tied up, expression blank like someone carrying fear and exhaustion. Another lead involved a motel worker who remembered a young woman asking about jobs and claiming to be a runaway, dropping little details that sounded like they were meant to convince adults she came from a normal home. A runaway from Florida. A father who was a dentist. A story that might have been true or might have been survival. A way to sound less vulnerable. But leads didn't become answers. Employees didn't remember. Names weren't recorded. The trail went cold again and again. At one point, investigators believed she might be a missing California teen named Diane so strongly that officials even made public statements suggesting an identification. But later, DNA testing ruled it out. Another dead end. More years, and while the public saw only a mystery and a headstone, Something else was happening in the background, something that should have broken the case open far earlier. Years after the murder, Arthur Kinlaw was already in prison for other violent crimes. His wife Donna was arrested for an unrelated offense, and during interviews she began describing violence, threats, and a teenage girl brought into their lives in 1982. Donna's statements, along with what she later told journalists, painted a chilling scene. A girl brought to Kinlaw's home, a refusal to cooperate Kinlaw, leaving with her and returning alone, a frantic effort to clean and destroy evidence, and a terrifying warning to Donna to keep quiet. She also recalled reading a news story about a body found in a New Jersey cemetery and watching Kinlaw panic, obsessed with whether the article described the victim in ways that could identify her. According to her, his fear wasn't hypothetical. It was personal. It was the fear of a man who believed he'd left a trail back to himself. But here's the brutal reality of cold cases. Suspicion isn't enough. Even confessions can be complicated when they're uncorroborated, when timelines don't align neatly, or when the victim's identity can't be confirmed. For years, investigators circled the Kinlaw connection, but without knowing who Princess Doe was, they couldn't anchor her to Long Island. They couldn't prove where she'd been living, who she'd been seen with, or how she ended up in New Jersey. Without a name, she was a ghost in the legal sense, present, but hard to place. And then, in 2005, Kinlaw reportedly wrote a letter from prison asking to be interviewed, offering to confess to the Princess Doe murder. A confession from behind bars should have been a siren. Instead, nothing immediate happened. Whether it was bureaucracy, jurisdictional complications, lack of resources, or the simple tragedy of a system overloaded with violence, the result was the same. The case stayed unresolved. A man offered to talk. A girl still had no name. The headstone still read Princess Doe. Yet the community of Blairstown did something rare. They adopted her. In January 1983, 6 months after she was found, Princess Doe was buried with funds raised by local people strangers who refused to let her be dumped into an unmarked grave. Over the years, her grave received flowers, notes, and quiet visitors. On anniversaries, people gathered near the ravine where she was found, displaying her clothing on a mannequin, sharing her composites, pushing the story back into public view. It wasn't just mourning, it was persistence, a message to the world that anonymity would not be the final chapter, and that persistence mattered more than anyone knew. Because eventually, science caught up to what compassion was trying to do all along. In 2020, investigators exhumed Princess Doe again, not for spectacle, but for technology. By then, forensic genetic genealogy had changed the landscape. When DNA is too degraded for traditional identification, specialists can sometimes build a genetic profile strong enough to search for relatives in public genealogy databases. It's a method that has solved cases once considered impossible. Samples were collected, tiny pieces that still held biological truth, and sent to a lab capable of extracting usable DNA from old, damaged remains. The result was the turning point the case had been waiting for. Investigators obtained a high-quality DNA profile, and genealogists built a family tree from distant matches, slowly narrowing possibilities. The way you narrow a maze, by tracing each branching corridor back to its source. And then, finally, a name emerged that fit. A family in New York. A missing teenage girl from 1982. A story that had been running parallel to Princess Doe all along, separated only by the absence of proof. In 2022, 40 years after the body was found, Princess Doe was identified as Dawn Rita Olanick of Bohemia, New York. The announcement landed like a shockwave, not because people didn't want it to be true, but because it meant the headstone had been telling the truth in the most painful way. She had been missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all. Her brother Robert, who hadn't seen her since she walked out in June 1982, finally had an answer. And with her identity confirmed, investigators could do what they couldn't do before. They could connect Dawn's disappearance on Long Island to the orbit of Arthur Kinlaw, and they could revisit old statements with new certainty. The name closed the gap that had protected a suspect for decades. Soon after, authorities announced that Arthur Kinlaw was charged in connection with Dawn's homicide, based on the renewed investigation, witness information, and his own alleged admissions. By then, Kinlaw was already in prison for other murders, a violent history that made the accusations feel less like a shocking twist and more like a terrible consistency. The legal process in cases like this can be slow, and outcomes depend on evidence standards, admissibility, and jurisdiction. But the philosophical outcome, the human outcome, had already happened. Dawn was no longer Princess Doe. She was Dawn, a girl with a school, a family, a hometown, a face people could picture again, even if the killer tried to destroy it. And that brings us to the question that sits at the center of this case. Like a weight, what does justice look like after 40 years? For some families, justice is a conviction. For others, it's simply the truth spoken out loud, the name restored, the lie of unknown, finally erased. Because unidentified victims don't just lose their lives, they lose their histories. They lose their birthdays, their nicknames, the sound of their name in someone's voice. Dawn lost all of that for 4 decades, and yet she was still remembered by strangers who refused to let her become nothing more than a case file. If there's one lesson in Princess Doe, it's that time can hide the truth, but it doesn't destroy it. Not completely. Not if there are people willing to keep asking, and not if science is finally capable of hearing what the past left behind. So here's where I'll leave you. Dawn Rita Olanick was 17 years old. She was not a legend. She was not a symbol until the world forced her to be one. She was a teenager trying to survive a difficult moment in her life. And she crossed paths with someone who treated vulnerability like an invitation. For 40 years, her grave carried a name that wasn't hers. Now, at least, the world can say her real name again. And maybe that's the first step toward something resembling peace. If this case hit you the way it hit me, subscribe to Unsolved Crime, because we don't let stories like this disappear. And tell me in the comments, what shocked you more, the fact that the case stayed cold for 4 decades, or the fact that a confession allegedly existed and still the wheels barely moved? And one more question. Should her headstone remain Princess Doe as a symbol for unidentified victims? Or should it be changed to Dawn Rita Olanick, so her family sees the truth carved in stone? I'll see you in the next case. Stay sharp, stay safe.